All right, welcome back in. This is the Joe Gaither Show on SpursCentral. Your home for the San Antonio Spurs on SI. I am Joe Gaither. He is Matt Guzman, and we are here to keep you going through the San Antonio Spurs off season. Make sure you follow Matt Guzman at MattGZMan. Make sure you read all of his great work at San Antonio Spurs on SI. He's got a great series that we are going to get into here in just a little bit today. We're going to talk about Victor Wembanyama, of course, right here on the San Antonio Spurs on SI, the San Antonio Spurs on SI YouTube channel, or you're looking at us on my own social media machines at Joe Gaither6, or checking us out on your favorite podcast platforms, the Joe Gaither Show on SpursCentral, on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and Amazon. Matt, how we doing today? You making it through the off season? Are you surviving?
That's right. I'm trying my best. We are really getting through it. I think it's a little bit under 4 weeks remaining until we have some actual content to get into. We are in the dead of the off season, but we're getting through. It's always nice to be on the Joe Gaither Show to kind of help us through that gap.
I was just kind of envisioning us mummifying ourselves until media days gets rolling because, from now until then, we're kind of in the desert. But we're going to get us through.
Absolutely.
As we got going, or as I was, kind of thinking about today's episode, look, we've done a lot of Victor Wembanyama and legacy talk, but he's in an interesting position. He's in an interesting position in the fact that he went to a franchise that already has two really high-level Hall of Fame type players, not necessarily always playing his position, but playing power forward, playing center, playing in the front court right there in David Robinson and Tim Duncan. So maybe think about really his legacy as it compares to David Robinson and Tim Duncan. And obviously he's just 1 year into it. There's no NBA titles and he doesn't have 15, 20 years on his resume. But where does he stand with those two guys as far as skill set, as far as what he needs to do to be on their pedestal or in their atmosphere, in the Spurs fans' minds?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you bring those two guys up because the very first article I ever wrote on Victor Wembanyama was basically along those exact lines. The Spurs, for the third time in franchise history, got the number 1 overall pick via the NBA draft lottery. So it was one of those things where they're kind of looking at, all right, well, there's a clear number 1 option here. From that moment, it was essentially set in stone. Nobody was worried for a second that the Spurs would pick anyone other than him. And as such, from the day that the Spurs got that number 1 overall pick, it was kind of the pressure started mounting on Victor because he was about to head to this franchise that, like you said, had two players of his, two big men that had already kind of carried a legacy, that had won championships, that had made the Spurs as storied a franchise as it was. And so to me, Victor Wembanyama kind of entered the league facing those, not only expectations of his peers and the media who were expecting him to do really well, but he was facing the expectations that he had to do as well as Tim Duncan and David Robinson did. And interestingly enough, I don't know if you knew this, both Tim and David in their first seasons with the Spurs helped the Spurs jump from about 20, 25 wins to in the 50s in 1 year. And so some of the discourse was, well, are the Spurs going to be a 50-win team? And would it be a disappointment if they weren't a 50-win team? Obviously, that was far from the case. But at the same time, Victor's not in any position to be criticized over his game. He did exactly what he needed to do and even played through an injury. Most of the games that he showed out in were games he was on a minutes restriction. And so, like you said, he doesn't have quite the resume just yet. But I think he's on the right path. I think what we have seen from him is everything that we've needed to. And I'm curious your thoughts.
Okay, well, I think absolutely that you're right, that he is on the path to, he's on the path to being in that class as far as resume goes. But I would argue a different side, or looking at it through a different prism, a different lens. If you had a draft with Tim Duncan, Victor Wembanyama, and David Robinson, and I told you, the David Robinson prospect is going to give you X, and then the Tim Duncan prospect is going to give you Y, exactly what those careers gave you. And then I said, well, you don't know what Victor Wembanyama, what that prospect's going to give you. Now it's going to give you a Rookie of the Year, but I won't promise you anything else. Who are you taking
Yeah.
first?
It's tough to go against the recency bias, right, that we have from Victor being on the team right now. But I mean, to me, Tim Duncan is one of those players that people, the people who really know the NBA and who have followed it for a good while, they know exactly how impactful and how good he was, albeit he wasn't super exciting per se. That wasn't his brand. He went and he shot off the he did his little shots from the side of the backboard. He banked in his shots, and from what we've seen, what I've heard, he would hit you with these little like, ooh, got him, got you, like he would talk dirty to you, right? But he wasn't that flashy
Under his
player.
breath.
But exactly. Exactly. And that was his brand. He was very calm and collected, but he was a poised leader. And he led the Spurs to, he got them to a championship plenty of times. And,
5 titles
he
for
didn't.
Tim Duncan.
That's right. 5 titles for Tim Duncan. He didn't need to be as flashy as, maybe some of the other current NBA stars or some of the stars back then, but he got the job done. He made the Spurs a true dynasty. And to me, I mean, I would pick Tim Duncan right now. If I wasn't promised what Victor Wembanyama might be able to deliver with the Spurs, I think.
I think I lost the very end of your answer there. You said if you weren't promised what you're promised with Victor Wembanyama and the Spurs, then.
That's right. Then I would make sure that Tim Duncan was number 1 overall.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, it's interesting because, I mean, you look through Tim Duncan and David Robinson, both of them winning Rookie of the Year, obviously in different times. Robinson in 1990, Tim Duncan in 1998. You got 5 championships out of the Tim Duncan career, 2 championships out of the David Robinson career, 1 MVP for David Robinson. How many MVPs? Any MVPs? Oh, no. But he was a 3-time finals MVP. Oh, no, 2 times. 2 times NBA Most Valuable MVP, 2002 and 2003 for Tim Duncan. So obviously 2 guys with great careers. If you threw them all on a court, if you were playing pickup, who are you? Are you taking Victor first?
Now that is a different story. Absolutely. Look, Tim Duncan's great, and I'm sure I would be incredibly scared to pick against him. But in a pickup situation, if you have the opportunity to grab a 7'4" player who can dunk and who can pass and who can steal and defend and run a court and shoot from 3, I don't think there's any other option, really. He's kind of he checks all the boxes, and he's been that exciting player that the Spurs have hoped he's been. Now they're just waiting for those results to follow. So, if the pickup game can get him an NBA championship, then it's even more reason to pick him.
All right, so let's get into some actual content, because that's just all hypothetical hooey, off-season hooey, because we'll never see them on the court, unfortunately, together at the same time. Let's talk about one of your projects. You have written 5 Beyond Wemby for the 2nd straight year, or you're in the middle of writing 5 Beyond Wemby. This is your 2nd straight year taking on the project. You are 2 Beyond Wemby so far, about to drop your 3rd Beyond Wemby. So we got a couple more pieces left to go in the series. You can read it on San Antonio Spurs on SI, reading about Stephon Castle and reading about Harrison Barnes. Let's just start big picture. What's the thought process or goal with the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So last year, with Victor entering the fold, all of the media attention, everything that was related to the Spurs was about Victor, and rightfully so. A player of that caliber coming to a team that needed vast improvement, it made sense that he would be the centerpiece of it all, and he will be. But I was kind of looking at the team, and I was like, well, hey, there's plenty of content out there on Victor, and sure, I'll add to that. I'll give you some pieces on Victor, but I think that there's some players on the team, like, it'd be important to note the supporting cast that he would have around him, because sure, he could be as good as he can, but if you don't have players around him, or if you don't know who those players are, you don't know the team as well as you might hope, or as well as you should. And so I kind of looked at the roster, and I was thinking, well, here are 5 players that, whether it was because of summer league or because of their past talent or just their situation, primed for big years beside Victor Wembanyama. And so last year I did Julian Champagnie, I did Dominic Barlow, I did I believe it was Zach Collins was on there, Devin Vassell was on there, and there was one other, Malachi Branham. He was my 5th. And so if we look back at those, Julian Champagnie is still on the rise. He didn't, he showed flashes of the explosive be. Dominic Barlow is obviously no longer with the team. Zach Collins had a very disappointing year. Devin Vassell, however, has a really good he's the one that's likely to take the biggest step up this upcoming season. So I'm going to put him back in the project this year. And we can get into that a little bit more. But the idea behind the project is just to highlight 5 names and why they might be poised for big years, why they might be very big, additions or big helps to Victor Wembanyama and to the Spurs as a whole.
All right, we're 2 into 5 beyond Wemby. So let's start with the first 2 that you have already published. And again, I want to encourage everybody to read this at San Antonio Spurs on SI. You started, it looked like number 1 was Harrison Barnes, traded from the Sacramento Kings. And when I think, we'll just give you my perception and then you can give me the reality. When I think of Harrison Barnes, I think that he has fallen off the radar. I think he was drafted very highly with the Golden State Warriors and was a small part of that dynasty, and actually was kind of a part of, not that it was downfall, but a kind of a part of some of the not as rich years of the dynasty. But I guess was cast off the island in favor of Kevin Durant. But he goes from Golden State, he wins 1 championship. And then from there, he's basically with the Kings, and he's basically just kind of lost his way or been a guy. I mean, you look at his stats, and he's definitely not been bad. He's averaging double figures basically every year. Yeah, every year, 19, 18, 16, 17, 14. So like all the way through. So he's obviously been playing well. But I just think of him as a guy who's been off the radar. What did you find out about Harrison Barnes? What might I have been missing over the last couple of years, the missing Harrison Barnes years? What do you think he's going to add to this year's San Antonio Spurs roster?
Absolutely. I like that you mentioned, he was a part of that Golden State Warriors squad before they started winning. And back then, he wasn't supposed to be the player that changed everything and changed the course of the Warriors, but he did win a title because he ended up sticking around and producing enough to help them get there. And so one of the biggest things that I found with Harrison Barnes is that, just the fact that he had that year playing in Curry where they won a championship, he experienced what it's like to be at the top. He's seen what a player like Curry does to prepare for games and how he can impact a team. He kind of, I'm sure that throughout his 4 or 5 years there, he gleaned a lot from Curry and learning how to lead and learning how to prepare. And he took that to the Mavs for 3 years. They didn't, or I guess 2 years, and then he got traded in the middle of the third one. And he didn't, there wasn't much to be said there. So he landed on the Kings, and he's been there ever since. I think what he brings to the squad is obviously a lot of experience because he's been in the league for quite a few years. But when you think about a guy that you bring in for experience, typically it's a player that's, Udonis Haslem-like, where they're not playing many big minutes. They're just there to kind of boost the morale in the locker room, to kind of help the younger players to get up to speed, but they're not really going in and showing you how it's done. Harrison Barnes is at the point right now where he still has that left in him. I think on his career, he's just under 40% from 3. He's hit that mark a couple of times throughout his career, but he's showing that he can go out and be a sharpshooter for any team that needs him to be. Obviously, Spurs had Doug McDermott. They didn't end up needing him. They sent him away at the trade deadline, and he went to the Pacers. But the Spurs have been looking for that shooter, that's somebody who can come in and be a very dynamic scorer that can shoot from 3 and open up the floor, especially now that Victor Wembanyama is in the fold, because a lot of the defense will be moving in on him as he's going to the rim. So with guys like Stephon Castle and Chris Paul, who are going to make that only more dangerous, it's going to be even more important to have guys out in the corners or the wings, just to kind of boost that three-point production to help open that floor up a little bit. And Harrison Barnes, from what I've seen, obviously has that experience, and he will get to be a mentor to some of these younger players, but he'll also be able to go onto the court and produce and shoot 3-pointers and open up the floor and just help that Spurs team just kind of get a little bit better, play a little bit more cohesively. And so that's what I like the most about him, is that he kind of brought both sides to the table.
All right, so we're excited about Harrison Barnes and what he's going to bring to the team, even though that he's, let's be honest, probably the lesser of the 2 veteran additions with Chris Paul and Harrison Barnes. Let's move into number two. Number two, you've written about the rookie, Stephon Castle, number 4 overall draft pick. And we've talked about him a couple of different times, but let's go back under the microscope with Stephon Castle and what we think. I mean, am I being out of bounds by thinking that he can become? I mean, I think that he can become a primary ball handler this year, but obviously he's very young, and the NBA is a grown man's league. What did you learn about Stephon Castle as you're looking at him as a part of your 5 Beyond Wemby series?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the bigger things to remember about Stephon Castle as you're kind of, preparing to watch him on the court is that the Spurs have been watching him play since high school. They've really had their eye on him for a while because, like you said, he has the ability to be a primary ball handler. Now at UConn, and I think this is probably the biggest, this is a little bit more public, it's clear he wasn't a primary ball handler with UConn. He was more of a stop and shoot, a shooting guard type role. And that's what they needed. They had guys that could shoot and that could be solely, like all they did was catch and shoot. Stephon Castle was kind of in between that and a point guard because UConn was a very, very good squad. Obviously, they won the championship, and Stephon Castle played a part in that. But he also didn't need to be the main ball handler. He didn't need to be the number one option. So the Spurs, what they saw from that was just his ability to adapt because he went from high school where he was the guy to a squad where he kind of played more of a role instead of being a star, and it still worked out because he was able to adapt and contribute in a different way. Whereas some stars, sometimes they get kind of delegated to a different role and they can't quite produce the same because they need the ball in their hands. This is not the case with Stephon. And so we've talked about this a couple of times, right? There's multiple options for the way that he can produce for the Spurs next season. He can obviously be one of the primary ball handlers. He might be able to take over for Chris Paul midway through the season, or they could kind of play him in that shooting guard role and let him play alongside Chris Paul or alongside Trey Jones or somebody that can go in and their job is to facilitate the offense, to do the ball handling, and Stephon Castle can kind of just play a very supportive role, because he's a combo guard. So he's not necessarily bound to have the ball in his hands to be successful. And I think that's one of the biggest things about him is that, he's going to learn to play with Victor, and they're going to learn how the two of them can be a dynamic duo of sorts, because Chris Paul's only going to be here for a season. And once he's gone, it's going to be kind of Castle that's, is he going to be the ball handler or is he not? And so I think this is going to be a big year for him to figure out his role, but also show that he can play both positions even at the highest level.
All right, the guy that you're working on third is an interesting person. It's someone who I think the Spurs have under the microscope. You're working on for your 5 Beyond Wemby. Number 3 is Blake Wesley, going into his third year as a guard for the Spurs. To me, and again, this is the ignorant perspective, you need to correct me, I see them draft Stephon Castle. I see them bring in Chris Paul, and that puts Blake Wesley a little bit on the outside of the favor, the organizational favor. What are you writing on with Blake Wesley, and what kind of a season, what does this year really mean to the trajectory of his young career?
Sure. Yeah, well, Blake Wesley, obviously coming from Notre Dame, he's a player that the Spurs have kind of plugged in a couple of different places just to see what it would look like. I remember around Christmas time this past season was when he started to get some more minutes. And when we asked Popovich, hey, so why is Blake Wesley getting some more time? He said, well, he's earned it. And it was simple as that. He's one of those players where, he's on the Spurs. He's still got a year on his contract, maybe more. I'll have to do some more research on that before I post. But he's a player. He's not necessarily, it's not a make or break year for him. But he's definitely a player who's more on the side of, he has a lot to show. And I believe that there's going to be a chance for him to do so. Like you mentioned, the Spurs have guys like Chris Paul, and they have guys like Stephon Castle who they're going to look to. He's one of those players where if they do decide to put Stephon Castle at that shooting guard role for the season, it's kind of going to be on Blake Wesley to compete with Trey Jones or to fill in those minutes that Trey Jones is not there when Chris Paul's not there. You can never have too many, options at the point guard, at the shooting guard for a team this young, because there's still going to be players that, you want to see just where they could be depending on who's on the floor. And so Blake Wesley is one of those guys where he can play with just support. And from what they've seen from him so far, he has potential. And I think that he's one of those players that is primed to show exactly what that potential is, because there is a demographic of Spurs fans who are kind of looking at this guy like, why do we still have him? What does he bring to this team? And I think for that reason alone, he's a player that could show, hey, well, here's why I'm here. and here's what I can bring to a squad, and I might be the guy that you can look to in the fourth quarter. I can get the ball to players, but I can also take a step back if I need to. So I've liked what he's shown on the court, and I think it's going to be a year for him to show exactly what he's capable of.
He is Matt Guzman. You got 3 more on your 5 Beyond Wemby series. Who else are in the tank as we tease the audience right here on the Joe Gaither Show?
Yeah, we've got Devin Vassell coming up for the second straight year. He was definitely supposed to be the superstar next to Victor last year. Some injuries kind of hampered that latter part of his season, but he definitely is a very capable scorer, a very capable dual threat. So I'm looking for him to take a step forward. And then we have Jamari Bouye, a player that many Spurs fans might not even know. He was one of the summer league standouts. He definitely showed, the Spurs liked him at the end of last year when they converted his two-way to a standard for the rest of the year, and now he's back on that two-way deal. They signed him to a 2-year two-way deal. So he didn't expire at the end of the year, so he will be coming into the season on the second year of that deal. Could be converted to a standard contract, could not, but at Summer League, he definitely showed that he's very confident. He's very young and small. His frame is very small, but he's very elusive. And he showed at Summer League that if you give him the space, he can get through it and get some points.
We are going to look forward to that as Matt Guzman takes us through the offseason right here on the Joe Gaither Show on Spurs Central. Matt, we appreciate your time, man. We got to catch up with you next week as you conclude your 5 Beyond Wemby.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me as always.
Absolutely. Is Matt Guzman. Follow him at MattGZMan. Follow his work at SAS on SI on the Twitter machine. And make sure you check out the home website, San Antonio Spurs on SI. We'll be back next week for another edition of the Joe Gaither Show right here on San Antonio Spurs on SI.